Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIMH, Robert C. O'Brien. Here's a little recap of what we have read so far. So, Mrs. Frisbee is a mouse with a family. She's a widow because her husband had died, which we'll find out later in the story of why he died. But little Timothy, he is a little tiny mouse who is sick. And Mrs. Frisbee goes out one day to see Mr. Ages, a rat, like a rat that's a doctor, to get Timothy some medicine. She gets the medicine, 3 doses, from Mr. Ages and heads back to her house. And on her way back to the house, she comes across a crow named Jeremy. And Jeremy is stuck in something shiny. And remember, crows like things that are shiny, they collect them. And this shiny thing that he is stuck in is ribbon from a gift that was thrown out. So remember, we talked about how we can't just take our trash and throw it around because animals, kind of like Jeremy, can get sick or injured or died. And so Mrs. Frisbee helps Jeremy get out of this shiny ribbon by gnawing away at it with her teeth, and he is free. And he responds by saying, "Thank you, Mrs. Frisbee. You are amazing. I don't know how I can ever repay you for you saving my life." Um, because one, he was caught, and two, there is Dragon, the cat, who likes to eat birds or chase birds, and then also likes to eat and chase mice and rats around. And so Jeremy is forever thankful for Mrs. Frisbee saving his life and her life by getting him out of this trap of a ribbon. So he says, "I will do whatever you need, just let me know. And if you can't find me, let any of the birds know because the birds can find me so I can repay you with whatever you need." Mrs. Frisbee then heads back home and gives Timothy some of his medicine. And as she's walking home, she realizes that it is spring, and spring means that the tractor is coming out on the Fitzgibbon farm. And that means that the tractor is going to come out and plow the field. And the field is where the cinder block is that they live inside of. And once that plow comes through, her family and her house is going to be destroyed by this plow. But she realizes that she can't get out and move her family to a safer home because Timothy is sick. And if she were to move him, because he's so fragile and sick right now, and because it's cold outside, that he most likely would die. So she is now stuck in trying to figure out what she's going to do with her family to save them and herself. So she takes Jeremy up on his offer, and the next day she goes and finds him, and she jumps on his back, flies through the air miles and miles above the forest, and they go to visit the great owl. And Mrs. Frisbee's biggest fear is, one, seeing an owl because owls like to eat mice, and she is a mouse. But Jeremy the crow says, "Oh, don't worry, it'll be fine. He's wise and he's old, and it's just what he does. He helps out anybody." So Mrs. Frisbee crawls into the hole that's inside of the great owl's tree, and goes and talks to him. And he says that she needs to have her home moved by the rats to the lee of the stone. And remember, the lee of the stone, she comes to find out, is the side of the stone that does not get any wind. And so because of that, that means that the plow is not going to plow up her home if she can get it moved there. So Mrs. Frisbee says thank you and is confused on what that means because she doesn't understand what rats have to do with moving her home. But she talks to Jeremy as he flies her back home. And Jeremy just says, "Just do what the owl says. Listen, the rats are something special. You'll figure out later why, but just do what he says." So Mrs. Frisbee goes back home, and Timothy takes his second dose of medicine, and he's slowly getting better. The next day, she ventures out to the rose bush where the rats live, because one time she saw the rats walking across the field with a string of lights and heading into the rose bush, which also confused her because Dragon, the cat, was laying there and not paying any attention to those rats, and she was very confused because obviously a cat normally would go and chase after a bunch of mice, but Dragon was sleeping. So as Mrs. Frisbee is thinking about all that, as she crawls into the rose bush, into the rat's home, and she walks down the tunnel, she comes across the entrance, and at the entrance is a mouse named Brutus who kind of yells at her as she is asking where Justin is, and he says, "No, you're not allowed here. Go away." So very sadly, Mrs. Frisbee walks slowly back out of the hole of the rose bush, and as she's doing that, she comes across Mr. Ages. Remember, Mr. Ages is the doctor who gave her the medicine. And Mr. Ages is walking very slowly because he has a broken leg that's all bandaged up, and he's using a crutch. And come to find out, Mr. Ages ended up being attacked by Dragon as he was trying to do something for the rats, but he ended up living. So Mrs. Frisbee goes back with Mr. Ages because Mr. Ages says, "Come on, Mrs. Frisbee, let's go talk to Brutus." And they go back to the entrance, and Brutus is very upset because Mrs. Frisbee did not listen to him, and she came back with Mr. Ages. Eventually, Justin, who Mrs. Ages was looking for, comes to the entrance and takes over, and Justin and Brutus and Mr. Ages and Mrs. Frisbee walk inside the rat's home. Brutus is very upset because he is very confused on why this is all happening, but Mr. Ages and Justin assure him that everything is okay and that Mrs. Frisbee is not an intruder. So they walk down and they go inside the library where they meet Nicodemus, another mouse. And they say, "Mrs. Frisbee, we'll be right back. We need to have our meeting quick and then we'll do some explaining to you. But in the meantime, please just stay here inside the library and you may look around and read some books." Oh, and one thing I forgot too, as I was just talking, when she was walking down the hallway to the library, she saw the string of lights down the tunnels of the hallway, and that's what lit up the halls of the rose bush underneath the ground. Those lights were the ones that the rats were carrying across the ground that she saw prior to actually going into their home. So Mrs. Frisbee is sitting inside of the library and she's looking through books because she is somewhat of a genius, as Mr. Frisbee, her husband, had taught her how to read. So she was able to read some of the books. And she also came across a board that had a writing on it, and it said, "The Plan of the Rats of NIMH." And so she's very confused by this and trying to figure out what that means. And as she's trying to figure that out, in walks a young girl mouse named Isabella, who comes to the library to learn how to read, and she's doing her studies. She talks to Mrs. Frisbee a little bit and gives some information about the rats and how they're kind of geniuses, although she doesn't know a whole lot of information. And she comes to learn that Isabella has a little bit of a crush on Justin the rat because whenever she sees him or talks to him, she blushes and giggles. So she learns that Isabella has a little bit of crush. Eventually, Nicodemus, Mr. Ages, Brutus, and Justin come back and they talk to Mrs. Frisbee and they tell her that they have some information to let her know. And they explain that at one point in time, they were used as lab rats in a laboratory called NIMH, and they were given injections every single day. And these injections were there to were supposed to help them live forever, along with making them smart. And as they're sitting inside the lab and getting these injections, the rats begin to learn how to read. And there are also mice that are inside of the laboratory as well. And that's where Mr. Frisbee, Mrs. Frisbee's husband, comes into play. He was actually one of the mice that was used for lab experiments. Mrs. Frisbee then explains, hey, I need to be able to move my home and save my babies because the plow is going to be coming soon through to plow up the fields as it is turning to be spring, and the great owl had said to come to you guys, the rats, for some help. And the rats explained, well, we can definitely do that. We can move your home to the lee of the stone. Mrs. Frisbee asks how they're going to do that because of Dragon, the cat, being, coming and attacking them. And they said, oh, we'll just give him a sleeping powder. And a little light turns on in her head and she's like, oh, yes, that would explain why Dragon didn't come and attack you guys when you were carrying the lights across the field. And they said, yes. And Mr. Aegis explains, yes, and that is how I became injured because I tried to put sleeping powder inside of Dragon's bowl, but it didn't happen, and I ended up getting attacked by him, but I survived. And Mrs. Frisbee, just so you know, and this is going to be a little bit of a shock and very hurtful for you to find out, but your husband was also one who used to put powder into Dragon's bowl to help him go to sleep so we could carry out our plan. And Dragon was the one who ended up killing your husband. Mrs. Frisbee was obviously very upset and very shocked, but also very thankful to know that now she has closure of how her husband had died. The rats talk about how they're not sure how they're going to be able to give Dragon the powder because the hole that they climb through in order to get to Dragon's bowl is a teeny tiny hole that a rat cannot fit through. And Mr. Frisbee was small enough to fit through, and Mr. Aegis was small enough to fit through, but the rest of the rats are not. Mrs. Frisbee volunteers herself to put the powder on Dragon's food. And the rats are all like, oh, no, you need to take care of your family. Mrs. Frisbee says, this is me trying to take care of my family. If no one else can do this because no one else can fit through the hole, then I have to do it because I'm the only mouse available in order to put the powder on the food. So this is where we left off in the book, and I will make some videos now of the chapters that we have yet to read. And from there, we will also have the chapter questions that we were doing in class. Those will be available on Schoology and transferred to Seesaw so you guys can answer those questions.